Morning. My name's Colin McLennan from Evans Capacitor Company. We're a small business in East Providence, Rhode Island. Make, oddly enough, capacitors. We had the privilege this year of being named Rhode Island's Small Business Subcontractor of the Year by the SBA. This was a great privilege. And ultimately, we found that award and then learned we won the regional award also. And ultimately ended up as the National Subcontractor of the Year for the SBA. Thank you. This was a great experience for us in a lot of ways. It allowed us to interact with a lot of the leadership in the state and the country. Traveled to D.C., met with Linda McMahon, met with Mr. Davis and a whole slew of folks. We had visitors from around the state, and Mr. Davis come visit us in East Providence. So it's been a great experience, and my privilege to introduce Wendell Davis, who is the regional administrator for the SBA. He was a managing partner at the DCB Law Group and attended Notre Dame Law School. He also has a unique experience in the SBA because he ran his own business for 15 years. So, Mr. Davis, thank you for coming and speaking to us today.
Thank you for that introduction, Colin. That was a surprise. That was a cool surprise. Can you follow me wherever I go, Colin? I like that. Evans Capacitors, I mean, they're one of the superstars, so that's really cool to start out the presentation with one of our superstars. Good morning, everyone. It's truly exciting to be here. It's also, more so, it's a true privilege to have the opportunity to speak to you folks at this really remarkable event. Being a political appointee and, as Colin mentioned, introduced as a former attorney, in some circles that's 2 strikes against me. So I'm going to try to do my best to earn your trust back and not get that 3rd strike. Groucho Marx once said that politics is the art of looking for trouble, finding it everywhere, diagnosing it incorrectly, and then applying all of the wrong answers. So rest assured, I will do my best to stay away from politics this morning. And I want to thank Molly. Is Molly here in the room? I want to thank Molly. She gave me 30 minutes. I can tell you, my staff only gives me 5 minutes. After that, they give me the hook. So, Molly, you may want to stay close. But given that armed with that 30 minutes, I'm feeling ambitious this morning. So we're going to do a couple things today. We're going to a little bit outside the box. First, despite being from the federal government and being surrounded by all these incredible governmental officials and wanting to talk about the great programming that the SBA has, instead, I'm going to talk about the individual. I'm not going to talk about the government in the beginning. I'm going to talk about the individual. And I'm going to talk about the critical role of the individual in our society. And also, I'm just going to briefly touch upon, this notion of the American dream ideal. And then 2, this is going to be a challenge. You guys are going to have to help me out a little bit. But I'm going to show you how Will Rogers can help inform us about small businesses. Yeah, Will Rogers, that guy from the 1930s. And then 3, we're going to give some good news. And just in case that Will Rogers thing doesn't work out, I figured I'd give you good news and you'll forget about it. And 4, I have a slide deck, and I'm going to talk about not really the flagship programs of the SBA, which is the 7A loan program and the 504 program, but some of the lesser known programs that are out there that are truly impactful and not everybody knows about. So let's dive right in. Just the other day, I was watching the Business Channel, which I have in my office all day, and this gentleman, Larry McDaniels, was being interviewed. I think it was Trish Regan that was interviewing him, and he was talking about how when he was only 3 years old, he and his brothers were told that his father went missing in action some 60 miles north of Pyongyang, North Korea. The date was November 2nd, 1950. And here he was in this interview, and he was holding the dog tags from his dad, almost 70 years later, and they had made their way back to the United States in one of those 55 boxes that we heard about that had been repatriated from North Korea a couple weeks back to the United States. And what struck me was his mention of the fact that this was the culmination of essentially a 70-year search. And it wasn't just a personal search that he and his brother undertook, but rather it was a search side by side with the U.S. military. A search that while we're going to work every day and we're operating our businesses, this is a search that goes on behind the scenes each and every day, a search for each individual soldier that's missing in action. And this elevation of the individual is in many ways unique to the United States military, especially when compared to other military organizations in other countries. But this elevation of the individual, it's also a part of our broader society, and specifically our entrepreneurial community. And I think it's important to note that this elevation, it didn't happen by accident, but rather it was embedded in the minds of our founding fathers and in our founding documents. If you look at the Declaration of Independence, it brashly declared, not only do individuals have, and we're all familiar with the right to life and liberty, but also this lesser discussed individual right. And that's that right to the pursuit of happiness. In doing so, our founding documents introduced this really revolutionary notion that each person's desire to pursue their idea of happiness was not mere self-indulgence, but rather, and this is important, it's a necessary component of a successful society. Our founding documents do not define what happiness should look like. It allows each individual to pursue a personal vision. The recognition that this simple individual, some would argue selfish pursuit as an inalienable right is truly breathtaking. This really was a seminal moment in the unleashing of the American entrepreneurial spirit and this notion of the American dream ideal. You know, Alexis de Tocqueville was a French historian who studied American society at the turn of the 19th century. He observed that the American dream, and I love this quote, the American dream is the charm of anticipated success. And while I love this quote, I think the larger takeaway is that here you have a French historian back in the early 1800s, and he's looking at America from the outside, and he's looking inward, and he recognized that this notion of an American dream, this entrepreneurial spirit, it was real, it was tangible, it was unique, it was special. And I think with that being said, though, I think it's important to note, and I think as we all sit here today, I think we all recognize that it took our society way too long to make sure that all have access to the American dream ideal. It took hundreds of years and great men and women like Abraham Lincoln and Susan B. Anthony and Martin Luther King to demand access to that American dream ideal. And we still struggle today to make sure that all individuals have access. You know, I'm often asked in my travels throughout New England, you know, what's the role of the SBA? And my answer has become, over these last 8 months, my answer is that when you distill it to its essence, the role of the SBA, and it's not just the SBA, it's all of our partners too, like our resource partners. I don't know if there's any folks here, but the Women's Business Centers, our VBOCs, our Veteran Business Outreach Centers, the SBDC folks and the SCORE folks. When you distill our role to its essence, it's to ensure that more and more and more people have access to that American dream. You know, I've had this incredible privilege of representing Linda McMahon and the SBA throughout New England. And I've had the opportunity to meet countless business owners. It's been nothing short of inspiring. And I know we have at least, and Colin, this is why you guys surprised me a little bit, we have at least 2 of our winners. You know, Colin was a superstar, but also Michael Industries, and I know Kelly Wendell was here, maybe not today, but yesterday. 2 of our winners, and these folks these are truly remarkable companies, and these are truly remarkable individuals. And what I want everyone to realize is how important our small business owners truly are. Not only for the role that they provide in our national economy and our local communities, but also the role they provide to their employees and the families of their employees. The SBA often talks about job creation in a mathematical way. 2 out of 3 new jobs are created by small businesses. I hear this day in and day out. And while I love that statistic, jobs are much more than a statistic. A job is dignity. Martin Luther King once pronounced that all labor has dignity. A job, and this is important, if anybody's taking notes out there, a job and stable work allows others to dream like many of you have dreamed here today. So a quick story. This is where we're going to segue into section 2 here. A quick story. earlier this summer, I was at a federal contracting event, Hanscom Air Force Base, just north of Boston. It was getting later in the afternoon, and I had to head up to Freeport, Maine that night, and I had a speaking engagement early in the morning the next day. So I left the event early, hoping to beat that Boston traffic heading north, which is just outrageous. And when I got to my car, thinking I'm doing pretty well here, I looked back in this back of the seat, I saw my dry cleaning. I realized, oh, you gotta be kidding me. My son's suit was in there. And this is one of those days where I picked up the dry cleaning in the morning, one of these crazy days where you're reacting, you're not thinking. And of course, in doing so, I invoked Murphy's Law. My son was going to this Model UN thing in New York, and it was literally the only day in the entire year he needed that suit. So here I am, 2.5 hours away from my home in Connecticut. So I call my wife and I'm like, hon, can you drive up here to Hanscom Air Force Base and pick up Brennan's suit and bring it home to him? She said, you're crazy, and hung up. And she does, for the record, she doesn't think I'm crazy. So I jumped in my car thinking I'd call her back, at some point and meet her halfway. So I drove the entire 2.5 hours home to drop off that suit. I see some of the men are saying, yeah, that's how you meet your wife halfway. You drive all the way home. I did get dinner out of it, but bear with me. There is a purpose to the story. And I started heading back up to Maine, but now it was really late. And I don't know if you've heard some of the radio program late at night. I got near the witching hour, and I don't know if you realize it, but the aliens took over northern New England. But I was turning the dial, and at some point, I ran into some programming and they were talking about this fellow, Will Rogers, who I really hadn't heard of. And after listening a while, I said, I really like this guy, Will Rogers. I did some research on him. And does anybody here remember Will Rogers? By show of hands, do we have anybody? This works a lot better if you guys know who the heck the guy is. For those of you who do not know his story, Will Rogers was a simple man, not very good at math or reading. He grew up in Oklahoma, the son of a rancher. He also had a dry wit and a way with words. A lot of his sayings have become ubiquitous in our society are attributable to Will Rogers. If you find yourself in a hole, the first thing you do is stop digging. That was one of Will Rogers' quotes. We've all used that or heard that. One of my favorites is, I know worrying works because none of the stuff I worry about ever happens. You gotta kind of think about that. That's why I like that one. But he was good with rope, and he had a number of rope tricks that he would entertain folks with. He also had this entrepreneurial spirit, and at some point as a young man, his dad, thinking he was crazy, decided he was going to take his rope tricks nationwide. And along with this wit that I mentioned, he became a national legend, touring the country and performing his acts in all parts of the United States and meeting all kinds of people. At his height, he was actually the entertainer of the year, ahead of the likes of Shirley Temple and Clark Gable. For all of you folks that didn't raise your hand, that would be like more popular than Beyonce, Drake, and The Rock combined, right? For a simple man, he really resonated with lots of folks. He was an incredibly positive person. Both parties had asked him to be their presidential candidate. Can you imagine that in this climate? Or Herbert Hoover at one point used Will Rogers to assure the nation in a radio address during the Great Depression. And he had kind of this vaudeville type act that he would take across the country, and at some point during his show, he would stop and he would come out to the front of the crowd and he would say, and I found this noteworthy, and this kind of became his calling card. And what he said was that he never met a man that he didn't like. And he didn't mean it in a literal sense. He obviously ran into bad people in his travels, but he was really speaking to his unwavering belief in the humanity of man, the backdrop being the Great Depression. And I can't help but think, and being mindful, and mind you, I've only been on this job for 8 months, and I haven't traveled the country. I've only traveled New England, really, but I've visited a lot of businesses. And in this short time, it made me think that I'd never met a small business owner that I didn't like. Again, not in that literal sense, although with Colin and Kelly, and literally. After meeting countless individuals and hearing their stories of perseverance, of commitment, of risk, of trials and tribulations and ups and downs, and the occasional success. Really, it's an occasional success. It just really embedded in me the importance of what they play in a successful society. So I thought it was important to tell you that story today. So good news. I don't know if that worked or not. So I promise good news. And the good news centers around the growth and health of our national economy. And being mindful of rhetoric. Lou Holtz Lou Holtz once said, he used to always say this, that when all is said and done, oftentimes more is said than done. So I'm acutely aware that oftentimes the rhetoric, it doesn't always meet or match the outcomes that we expect, but with respect to the national economy right now, the outcomes are real. The impact is real, and the news is encouraging. According to the July survey of the NFIB, the National Federation of Independent Businesses, the Small Business Optimism Index marked its second highest level in the survey's 45-year history, at 107.9, rising to within a tenth of a point of the July 1983 record high of 108. The July 2018 report also set new records in terms of owners reporting job creation plans and those with job openings. You know, there's one statement by the NFIB that I thought was particularly salient. The Small Business Optimism Index is, and this is their quote, on a stratospheric trajectory, thanks to the recent tax cut and regulatory reforms. You know, I was over in East Hartford, Connecticut earlier this summer, and United Technologies did a press conference with the Small Business Administration, and Linda McMahon flew in for that, and they announced at that press conference they're going to be hiring 35,000 people in the next 5 years, spending $15 billion in R&D and infrastructure and equipment improvements, $75 billion on the supply chain. And what was important for the Small Business Administration is that an estimated $20 billion of that was going to go to small manufacturing businesses. In New England alone, United Technologies has over 5,000 small businesses that are part of their supply chain. And I know that the primes in this room here today have similar stories. You know, UTC cited the recent tax cuts as one of the reasons for this incredible expansion. The corporate tax cuts have had a dramatic impact, not on just big companies, but also on the many small businesses throughout a company's supply chain. According to the July report by the ISM, the Institute of Supply Management, of the 18 manufacturing industries, 17 reported growth in July. Demand remains strong with the new orders index at 60 or above for the 15th straight month. The backlog of orders index continued expanding. Production and employment continues to expand. You know, we were told that manufacturing had left the shores of America and it wasn't coming back. Manufacturing is back and it's on the rise in America. And many of you in this room are at the forefront of this resurgence. You know, the tax cuts, the reductions in regulations, the enhanced commitment to the strengthening of our military has had a dramatic impact. You know, I had this opportunity to address a debate academy over in Connecticut. This job takes me in all kinds of different circles. And let me tell you, that was a really tough crowd. It's probably the toughest crowd I've had. These are some high school students all the way down to 6th and 7th grade, and they had some tough questions. And we discussed a number of items. You know, we discussed this notion of the American dream. We talked about entrepreneurship. We debated a number of topics. But at one point, you know, I offered the following resolution. Resolved that the current United States economy is the greatest economy the world has ever experienced. This is what you do in debate academies. I didn't argue that was the highest GDP growth that we have ever experienced. It's not. But that 4.1% in the last quarter was pretty good, pretty impressive. Nor did I make the argument that it's the greatest wealth expansion or creation, although you can make some arguments to that effect. But rather, I argued it is the greatest economy because it is the most expansive and it is impacting all sectors of the United States. The overall unemployment rate is at a historic low of 3.9%. African American unemployment is at a historic low. Hispanic unemployment rate is at a historic low. This economy is reaching folks who had all but given up. Female unemployment rate is at a 65-year low. In a recent July article, the unemployment rate for kids that have dropped out of high school reached its lowest level since the government started tracking this data back since 1992. The impact of this economy is broad. And dear and personal in my heart, in a recent article in the Chicago Tribune, they referenced that the unemployment rate for disabled persons is down to a historic low of 9.2%, the lowest level it's been since the government started tracking this data. And perhaps even more important in this demographic is the participation rate, which has always been historically low. It climbed close to that 30% threshold, which I can tell you is if we can bust through that 30% threshold participation rate, that'd be incredible. I know there's folks in this room that are committed to doing that, and that will get done. You know, we've gone from an economy where folks are saying, you know, where's the work, to an economy where folks are saying, you know, where are the workers? And I'm happy to say that I think some folks today have an answer on that. Right after I'm done speaking, we have a panel here of 4 people, and they're gonna address and talk about that workforce development issue. That's become the #1 issue as I travel across New England. Every company is saying, where are the workers? What are we gonna do? And I'm sure I'm gonna put some pressure on our next panel. You guys are gonna have all the answers, right? I could go on and on and on, but I do want to transition because I know my time is getting short, and I do have a slideshow. I do want to get into the programming of the SBA. So if we could, we got our big blue monster there. That's the new SBA logo. If we could flip to the next one. So Linda McMahon, I think most of you folks know her story. She tells her story. She's been a truly remarkable person to work for. I just can't express. I don't have enough adjective to express my gratitude, and also I'm just impressed with who she is. She has really, the whole field has really rallied around her. And she comes from the private sector. Her chief of staff, Pradeep, comes from the private sector, so there really is this private sector focus for the SBA. But she tells a story where she comes from a small business. Even though her company now is $6 billion, I think now, she started out in a small business, and she recalls and tells a story where she had the car repossessed from her home as she was sitting in her living room. They had their house foreclosed on. So she took that small business and she persevered and didn't give up, and now, it's a world company. If we could go, one of the strategic plans, just so you know, she does have those 4 pillars. We are adding another pillar to that, and that's probably breaking news for the SBA. But workforce development has become such a big issue. It's traditionally not the SBA space, and it's usually the Department of Labor, Department of Education, but we are adding that as a pillar to the SBA and what we need to do, workforce development. If we could go to the next. So, Small Business Investment Company Program. How many people have heard of that? If we go to the next slide, this is a teaser. That's what we call a teaser slide. So these are all the companies that have benefited from the SBIC program, the Small Business Investment Company Program. We go to the next slide. A lot of people don't realize, but the SBA actually funds venture capitalists. So there's over 170 approved or licensed venture capital companies that give out funds. They either do it through debt, through equity, or through a combination of debt and equity. And the SBA plays a role in that. If we go to the next slide, we can kind of see the macro numbers. If we skip down to New England, and I don't see a time frame on this, but $1.8 billion in New England, nationally $24 billion in the SBIC financing. So my point for raising some of these lesser known programs is, one, sometimes people don't realize that this may be an option for you if you're a small business and you're looking for equity funding. The next slide. International trade. A lot of folks think of commerce, which you should think of commerce when you think of international trade. But we do, when I speak to small businesses, I tell them a couple of things. One, you got to think globally, right? If you look at all the demographic and population trends over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, it's not occurring in Europe. It's not. The United States is in the top 10, but most of that growth is going to be in the Pacific Rim and Africa and South America and those areas. So you got to be thinking globally now. And the second thing is, even if you're a manufacturer, you got to be thinking like a technology company. But the SBA has loans, so for a lot of lenders, it's difficult to loan against trade across the seas. And we guarantee 90% of that loan, so it allows a lot of lenders to feel comfortable and sleep at night, really, by knowing they have that 90% guarantee. We can go to the next slide. So here's some of the macro numbers for, it looks like we have a 5-year data point here. New England, 296 million, 689 loans. We need more of those. Nationwide, 7.3 billion. Next slide. Government contracting. I know some of you folks probably have been involved in government contracting. 23%. When I came on board, I come from the private sector, and when I was first thinking about the SBA, I'm thinking, the SBA, it's loans, and they don't even provide the loans; they just guarantee them. I was shocked to find out all these other programs that they have. On the federal contracting side, 23% of all federal contracts are set aside for small businesses. So what does that mean? If you look at the next slide, that's $106 billion just last year alone, and that's divvied up. We talked about the role of the SBA reaching more and more people and giving them access to the American dream. It's really divvied up into 4 different categories: small disadvantaged business category, service disabled veterans. You can see that was $17.9 billion if you go over to 2017. Small disadvantage was $40 billion. Women-owned businesses were $20 billion, and Hub Zone, which are areas, distressed areas, $7.3 billion. So this is just 2017 alone. Pretty impactful programs. If we go to the next slide. Regional impact, New England, just last year, $3.8 billion. And you can see the breakdown. If we go to the next slide. The SBIR program, these are, again, a teaser slide. These are some of the folks that have benefited from the SBIR program. So the SBIR program just did a road tour, so I followed them from Rhode Island. We were in Rhode Island just last week. We were in Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Maine. And this is really an incredible program. And I know it was a Vice Admiral Johnson yesterday. He talked about really challenging yourself to be entrepreneurial. And he referenced the SpaceX folks and how, they celebrate failure. And he also talked about, and I'm trying to get to that quote, and it was a great quote from one of the SBIR folks, the SpaceX folks, where, just being kind of radical in your approach to getting out there and being aggressive with entrepreneurship. This may be a great way to do it, because you partner with the federal government. And so there's really 3 different sections to it. It's like a phase 1, and there's 2 different programs. Some of the agencies will put out an area where they want you to do research and development in. And in other areas, in other agencies, you can come up with whatever your great idea is. So this is a good way to partner with them, and there's a lot of grant money that's involved in that. If we switch to the next slide. Let's go to the next one. What some of the best things about SBR: non-diluted capital, IPA data rates, direct follow on phase 2. We'll talk about that when we go to the next slide. Before we get there, here's an impact study just for Navy. So this is just one of the federal agencies, if that comes up. In the last 10 years, $14.2 billion in total sales and new products and services resulting from the Navy SBIR Phase 2 contracts. So there's 3 different phases. The initial phase is a Phase 1, which is typically between $150,000 and $250,000, and you're putting a proposal forward to be accepted by one of the federal agencies. And if that proposal is essentially accepted and they find it, able to be commercialized, then the grant thereafter in Phase 2 is typically over $1 million. So we look at just the Navy program alone: $7 billion in sales and new products to the U.S. military, $44.3 billion in total economic output nationwide, $22 billion in value added, tax revenues, labor income, full-time jobs. That hits all the buzz points. Here's the agencies that participate: so USDA, NIST, Department of Defense, NASA, DHS. You see all the agencies there. Next slide. So here's those 3 phases I was talking about. Next slide. What does an SBIR firm look like? Company must be for-profit, U.S. owned, operated, under 500 employees. Work must be done in the U.S. And again, this is important. The focus is on the performing R&D. So it's really research and development. So hopefully it allows you to kind of expand your portfolio and really think outside the box and be like that those SpaceX folks. Next. Here's a total awards in New England. So this is just last year, so it's a pretty impactful program. State summary: New England, $8 billion. That's a lot of money. Next. So I put these slides in here just in case you're interested. Again, if we just reach one person, we're happy. So it's sbir.gov. If we go to the next slide, just to point out a couple of things. Let's go. There's a search. Go ahead, next one. One thing you can do going on there to see if this is a program that's right for you, they do have a section where you can identify successful firms, and you can identify agency investments in technology areas. So you can see some of the specific proposals and the specific areas of research that the different agencies are looking for. Next. They have a tutorial, so you can go on there if you don't know enough, you need to know more about data rights or IP protection. That's all in there. Next. Here's some examples. So some of the teasers, if you're interested, we can just every couple seconds just scroll through these. These are all New England companies that benefited from the SBIR program. Looks like Maine, Mass. We need a Rhode Island one. That's your job. That's not my. New Hampshire, Rhode Island. Here we go. Rhode Island, Far Sounder Inc. Another success story. These are Vermont. So that's the SBA programs that I wanted to emphasize. And again, not the traditional. Most folks deal with the loan programs. One thing I did add in, a couple of slides, because as part of this SBIR tour, there's this federal lab. If we go to the next slide, consortium, which I thought was really cool. So these folks, they're really a collection of all of the licenses and IP rights of the federal government. If you just go to the next slide too. So they make those licenses available to companies, and they'll work with companies. In fact, the lady that we were with last week, she talked about how, even their labs and their facilities and their equipment is available to companies. And she even mentioned like an electronic microscope. They actually gave one of theirs to a company in Virginia. I think she was out in California, because they had some product they were working on that they thought would be helpful. And if you go to the next one. So this is one of the slides that they throw up there. Who funded the tech and smartphones? And one of the things they mention is that 90% of the smartphones are in some way associated with the federal government, and there's a lot of licensing that goes on. So the fact that you can license, and they didn't tell us how much they charge for licensing, but they said it's very reasonable. They mentioned in certain instances, they've waived that licensing fee for small companies that are trying to get off the ground. So it was a really cool thing that I thought more folks should know about. I think that concludes the slides. How are we doing on time? Okay, 1 minute. That's pretty good. I could tell stories about Evans capacitor, but maybe that's at lunchtime. Again, folks, I thank you for your attention. I thank you for your time this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you. On behalf of SENEDIA, I think we have a.
Cool.
We have here we go. A fancy commemorative coin.
Okay, cool.
Thank you for taking the time and coming in and visiting us.
Is that valued under $23? I think I have a federal. I don't need the Inspector General.
Thank you.